Good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to see you. Hello, Anne again. Lovely to see you all. Welcome this afternoon to our poetry workshop with Mariah Whelan. Before I hand over to Jeff for the formal introduction, I'll just go through just a little bit of housekeeping with you. Mariah's going to talk initially and read some of her work. So if you'd be kind enough to stay on mute during that time. If any of you have brought anything with you that you would like to share, then you're very welcome to do so. And there'll also be an opportunity to ask questions. So when we get to that point, I'll just ask you either to put your question in the chat box below, or if it's something that you want to share with the group, then obviously to unmute. So I will pass over now to Jeff, who will introduce Mariah to you all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sally. So Mariah is our first poet in residence, which is fantastic. Why did we want poet in residence? We felt that although Homerton has a quite rich and varied tradition of being active in poetry, so Sir Andrew Motion, a former poet laureate, is an honorary fellow, as is Carol Ann Duffy. We've had the Poetry by Heart recitation contest for teenagers, but what we haven't had is a focal figure who could be at the centre of all of this and who was supplying something different, but something that would also bring all this together. So we're delighted that we have now Mariah Whelan. I'd like to thank also Norman Bardsley, who I can see on my screen, who I think is in California at this moment. But profuse thanks to you, Norman, for the donation in memory of your late wife, Jacqueline, that made all of this possible. And indeed, I believe that some of Jacqueline's contemporaries are with us over the weekend and may indeed be here today. So, I'll leave now. Matthew, our Director of External Relations and Development, will give a vote of thanks at the end. He may choreograph Q&A if there is Q&A, but the hour needs to take its own direction and find its own shape. Mariah is going to talk about poetry and connection and read some of her work. And it's great that you're here, Mariah, and great that you're all with us too. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Jeff. Hi, everybody. It's wonderful to see all your faces. As strange as it is not to be in a room together, it's still wonderful to have this technology connecting us. Imagine if this had happened even 5 years ago. So I just want to say a few thank yous, first of all. Thank you to Sally for running the weekend in collaboration with her team and for putting on this event, of course. Thanks to Jeff, who has now disappeared, for that lovely introduction. And I want to echo Jeff's sentiments by saying a huge thank you to Norman. Obviously, you've played a fundamental role in my journey to Homerton, and I am incredibly grateful for your role in that. And I really hope to bring some of Mrs. Bardsley's ideas about poetry, specifically how it can help us to express ourselves and how it can bring us together as communities into what I'm doing at Homerton over the next year or so. So thank you very much. And a final thank you to all of the lovely alumni who I can see in front of me. Thanks for coming and listening to me talking about poetry. It means a lot. Thank you. So today I'm going to talk to you about poetry of disconnection, poems in lockdown. And I'm going to kick off the session by introducing myself and giving a short talk on why, over the course of lockdown, which of course for many of us is still ongoing, I've been thinking about poetry and what it is about the form that makes it so well suited to the business of connection at times when we're feeling so disconnected. And I'm going to be taking us through some examples of very contemporary poetry and some more classic poems. And I'm going to focus on three main ideas about connection. So first, I'm going to focus on the way that images, and images are what I would argue are the building blocks of poetry, allow us to feel connected to the world during illogical and unreasonable times. So what do I mean when I say images? Well, images basically just means pictures. But they're not just visual pictures. They can be aural images, they can be smell-based images, touch-based images, anything that fires up one of the five senses. And then when I've talked a bit about images, I'm then going to talk about how poems can help us connect with people we love, especially when we can't physically be near them. And then finally, I'm going to talk a bit about the way that poems, regardless of subject matter, are always an act of connection, because they require collaboration between the poet, the page, and the reader. And once I've had a little think about those ideas with you, I'm going to move on and share with you some of my own poetry that thinks about connection. And then at the end, if you've brought any poems with you, we'll have a chance to share those together. And you can also ask me any questions you might have. So why am I so interested in this idea of poetry and connection? Well, to give you a bit more background about me, like many of us here today probably, I've always had an interest in reading and writing poetry. I studied English at school and at university and wrote a fair amount of poems when assigned them by my teachers. However, it wasn't until I moved to Japan that I really started writing seriously. I moved to Hiroshima, Japan when I was 22. I went from living at home and then later in student accommodation and shared houses to suddenly living in an apartment all on my own in a country where I barely spoke the language. And I think my poem writing practice really began at this time as a way of dealing with the isolation I was experiencing and the strange new circumstances I found myself in. Poetry became a way of recording my experiences and connecting with the world. I would go out and climb the ring of mountains that circle Hiroshima, and when I'd come home, I'd write about those experiences. And they weren't coming out as linear prose sentences or paragraphs. They were coming out as the images of poetry. In my notebook, I'd record the beaten copper sun as it slid below the mountains, the physical sensation of cold as it rose through my body at dusk, the clatter of bamboo stems in the wind. Shaping these visual, aural, and tactile images in text allowed me to connect with my new life. And I think it's this quality of poetry, its reliance on images rather than the logic of prose, that is one of the reasons why poetry has played such an important role in people's lives during this crisis. And during lockdown, poetry really has been everywhere. I run a magazine of poetry called Bath Mag, and our last submissions period opened pretty much around the same time as lots of countries were going into lockdown. And we received a deluge of poetry. Our submissions numbered 1,600, more than 3 times the normal amount we'd receive in a submissions period. And almost all of these poems were thinking about people's sense of disconnection from the world around them, from loved ones, and their attempts to try and engage in the strange times we found ourselves in. Moreover, I don't know how it's been for you, and for those of you living outside of the UK, but here in England anyway, the TV has been full of odes to NHS and key workers. And I feel like I can't turn around without a celebrity trying to read me a poem from their living rooms. We've had Stephen Fry reading Siegfried Sassoon, and Sir Patrick Stewart, who is still nobly making his way through Shakespeare's sonnets via his Instagram account. And I think this surge in poetry is because it doesn't ask us to resolve what's going on in the world and in our lives. It doesn't ask us to iron out its inconsistencies and paradoxes. By relying on images, it is a form that can capture life as it really is, in all its complexity and all its contradiction. So what I'd like to do now is share a poem that I think perfectly encapsulates this. So this poem should any moment magically appear on your screen. Maybe Sally or Matthew could give me a thumbs up if they can see it. Brilliant. Okay. And I'm going to read this poem for you now. This poem is called Unmute, and it is by a 17-year-old poet from Oxford, which I think is pretty impressive once you read the whole thing. Unmute by Lynette Drury. And how will our lips speak of it, released from their hot pressed masks? How will our head explain it, light after the loss of our uncut hair? How will our hands hold it when they've been told not to hold anyone and so often scrubbed clean of their sins? Will it be sung? Will it be sung with the hush of the silence, or with the voice the silence gave to songbirds? Will it be sung with the comfort the songbirds sang to the roads that miss the friendly feet? Will the roads speak, or the feet speak of their nostalgia, speak of their lost connection? Will it be spoken between the thunderous clapping colliding? Will it be spoken with the rage of our scrubbed hands clapping along streets, or with the hush of the silence that followed? And how will our lips speak of it, pressed from their hot pressed masks? How will our heads explain it, light after the loss of our uncut hair? Pretty impressive stuff from 17-year-old Lynette there, I think you'll agree. And what I want to zoom in on now are some of the images that are in this poem. And in particular, I want to focus on this beautiful image that occurs twice in the poem, near the beginning and then again at the end. How will our heads explain it, light after the loss of our uncut hair? This poem uses this extraordinary image of the post-lockdown haircut to explore the bewildering experience of the pandemic. The speaker imagines their head suddenly light, which implies a sense of release, but then describes the haircut as a loss. In a single line then, this striking visual and tactile image of a haircut holds two contradictory ideas within itself. It's that Keatsian idea of the power of a poem to express experience, even when careful consideration of that experience only leads to more uncertainty. The poem asks again and again, how are we going to speak about this when it's over? And it never offers an explicit answer. It only offers these images: the head shorn of its hair, the image of empty and scrubbed clean hands. And this does give us a way of thinking about the complex, bewildering, and isolating times we've lived through and are still living through, and what on earth the world is going to look like after this is all over. And it's this ability of a poem to connect past, present, and future that I want to think about next. I want to think about the way a poem allows us to connect with people we love and to the past. So for Dante Gabriel Rossetti, poetry, particularly the sonnet form, functions as a monument to memory. And I think this is particularly the case in the second poem I want to share with you today. I'm just going to get that up on screen now. So this is Seamus Heaney's poem for his mother, often titled When All the Others Were Away at Mass, which takes the first line of the poem, which appeared in a sonnet sequence called Clearances. And I'll read it for us now. When all the others were away at Mass, I was all hers as we peeled potatoes. They broke the silence, let fall one by one, like solder weeping off the soldering iron. Cold comfort set between us, things to share, gleaming in a bucket of clean water, and again let fall. Little pleasant splashes from each other's work would bring us to our senses. So while the parish priest at her bedside went hammer and tongs at prayers for the dying, and some were responding, and some crying, I remembered her head bent towards my head, her breath in mine, our fluent dipping knives, never closer the rest of our lives. So how does this poem function as a monument to a moment between mother and son? Well, once again, it's all about the images. In the first part of the poem, we have this beautiful evocation of a Sunday morning. We have the potatoes breaking the silence and that vivid visual simile that compares the falling potatoes to solder. Then in the second stanza, we have a shift in time. The poem's grammar switches into the present continuous tense, letting us know that the stanza before was in the past. But let's look again at that memory in the first stanza. Look at that key simile of the potatoes weeping. In poetry, every word comes under scrutiny. Choosing a word like weeping instead of melting or falling changes the emotional texture of a line. While there is separation between past and present then, the two are connected to each other. And of course, isn't this how time actually works? Time isn't a linear succession of moments, but more like a Russian doll where the past lives in the present and the past we remember always bears the trace of the person we are now. Poetry gets closer to the interconnectedness of time and people. And it is perhaps not surprising then that during this pandemic, people have used it to connect to the way we used to live and to each other. And the final thing I want to talk about today is the way that a poem is always an act of connection between the poet, the page, and the reader. And as a poet, this can be something that's quite tricky to get your head around when you spend so much time writing the poem. And it's also really tricky to teach emerging poets to get their heads around too. But it's definitely something I've come to believe in over my tenure as a poet. So what do I mean by this connective relationship between reader and writer? Well, my reading of the Heaney poem we just read is my personal interpretation. Just as Heaney brought all of his education and background to the writing of this beautiful poem, when I read it, I bring a whole new set of contexts. For the ancient Greeks, this relationship between the act of writing and reading was really, really important. One of the things that made poetry unique, they argued, was its charis. So charis is usually today translated as charity. So it's the charity of the poem. And for the ancient Greeks, it described the way that a poem is both entirely whole, but also incomplete once it's set down on the page until it's picked up by a reader. For all the hard work a poet puts in to generating images, shaping language, and refining tone and mood, once it's on that page, it's an unfinished object until someone picks it up. And a great poem that plays with this idea is by the US poet Billy Collins. And I shall share it with you now. Okay, Introduction to Poetry by Billy Collins. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a colour slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with a rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. So, what I love about this poem is the way it captures the collaborative act of writing and reading. Instead of trying to beat out of a poem what it really means, The speaker encourages us to pick up the poem, press it to our ears, enter into it, and look for our own light switch. And what happens when we switch on the light is up to us. Now, that's not to say, of course, that we as readers can ride roughshod all over a poem's meaning. We might not be interested in beating out what a poem really means, but likewise, we can't only scrawl our interpretation all over it. Poems, I would suggest, exist in a delicate balance of writer, their context, their history, the journey of the poem through the editorial process, and then through the context we bring as readers. A poem is a point of connection between at least two people, if not more, and it is a connection that is predicated on that idea of charis. It requires space and generosity. It asks that we get comfortable with shifting meanings and indeterminacy. It is then a kind of connection that speaks to the times we find ourselves in. And of course, poetry speaks to the situations humans have always found themselves in, whether it's Beowulf or 18th century satirical verse, or the kind of spoken word poetry I publish in my digital magazine. Poetry offers us forms of communication and connection that get closer to the way the world really is, in all its ambiguity, all its difficulty, but also all its joy. So those are my ideas about why I received 1,600 submissions when we opened up our magazine back at the end of February, beginning of March. It really does seem to be a genre that speaks to people when we go through extraordinary times. And it'll be interesting to see the work that is produced about this time in years to come. Hopefully when we can all hear people reading it in the same room, out loud, all together. That would be the goal for sure. So now that I have shared with you some of my ideas about poetry, I'm going to share some of my poems that resonate with the theme of connection. And I'm going to start by reading from my first collection that came out last year. This book is called The Love I Do to You, and it's a novel in sonnet. Yes, for my first ever poetry book, I decided to write a book-length sonnet sequence, which is quite the bonkers thing to do and not something I would recommend, but I did it nonetheless. And it tells the story of a nameless he and she, and the sonnets alternate between the two of them, and it tells their love story. It's partly set in the UK, it's partly set in Japan and South Korea, which, if you might remember from the beginning of my talk, is where I lived when I first started writing. So a lot of those images and impressions that I started writing down as a way of connecting with my new circumstances made it into this book. But it took, gosh, 16, 17 years from those initial compositions to actually ending up in a published book, which surprises people sometimes, but it can take that long. And I'm going to begin by reading the first poem. And something else I have to tell you is that the title of every poem in this book is a place name, which I think is a nice way of tying or connecting, I suppose, seeing as that's our theme, connecting the poems to the places that they are written about and in. This first poem is called The Coach Station, Newcastle upon Tyne. Bright station, and all around soft, dark. Toothpaste and sleep, coffee and the white crunch of salt on the concourse, the headlamps snorting, boarding the bus as the first gull calls began to ricochet. That's how it was the morning I left. Too cold for snow, the hills thick with February, slow black-backed and low to where the Tyne bloomed in the wake of a boat. I was less going somewhere than getting out, away from the terraces and rain, the tower blocks, the yellow metro stops that took me in loops out into the waking up day. But mostly, I was getting away from you, the river below me breathing, as all rivers do. So as you can probably tell from that, while it's a love story between he and she, it's not necessarily a happy love story all the way through. And the next poem I'm going to read for you is another poem from She. And this one is in Japan, which I want to share with you after talking about how that was the beginning of my poetry writing journey. So this poem is called Mount Soko, Hiroshima, Japan. All morning we followed the trail past hare runs and paths left by rutting tanaki. Up until the air iced our cheeks, glazed the rocks in mercurial dew, a corset of cool that laced the loosening ferns in silver. Up until we turned a bend and stumbled into light. Hiroshima lay below us like a toy. Tin cars turned down miniature roads, tree-lined avenues, patches of park, the blocks marked with a tower, billboard, or temple. Smoke curled under awnings, rivers forked, and boats broke the rust-coloured water where beachless the bay dropped off. Nothing between it and America, someone said, save Hawaii, and the million islets of the inland sea that pierced the horizon, making the dateline gauzy with fog. Well, this is it, someone said. The best view in Hiroshima. Welcome home. And this next poem, one thing I need to tell you about this, in addition to the he and she character, the she develops a best friend in Japan called Kristen, and you'll hear their name in this poem. Tsukiji Fish Market, Harumi Street, Tokyo. The last tuna lay on a wooden slat, dead, silver belly split, his curves and arch corrugated in snow. The meat hissed with cold. The ridged place where the gills once were, stuffed with tarpaulin, his head and lunar tail removed. The channels were thick with veinous slurry, our feet disturbing the hot froth of blood, bleach, steam escaping from opened bodies. There were buckets of octopuses still alive, eels elvering to catch what the fishmonger's knives sent flying. And we were desperate to show we weren't tourists. Stiffened when an American man reached to touch the tuna. Baka, Kristen hissed, meaning stupid. The chef looked up, laughed and reached across the stall with 2 fresh pieces. They wobbled on the blade, gelatinous with fish stink. Eat, he said, the trails of connective tissue dangling. And I think that's the last poem I'm going to read from now. We might have some more time at the end, in which case I'll come back. But I also want to share with you some poems I've been working on more recently. So I've just finished writing what will be my 3rd collection of poetry when it's published. It is not another novel in sonnets, thank goodness. That was hard enough to write just one of. It is a book that instead uses experimental poetry writing techniques to think about a relationship between a father and a daughter, ideas of English nationalism, and the impossibility of communicating in even the most close and special and intimate of relationships. So this first poem I'm going to read to you was shortlisted for the Creative Writing Award that Aesthetica run. And the poem is called Viaduct. And I'm going to read it for you now. Viaduct. When I was little, I spoke to the stones in my aunt's garden. The cool, milfoil slate, the heavy-bottomed boulders who whispered back about weight and patience, the folly of water. I put my hands on the stone and listened to its breathing. Water vapor and rust, the cold coming into my palm as if my hands might find and hold a knowledge I can't anymore. I've seen photographs of its construction, faces in half-light, sleeping shacks named for the Bible or Crimean victories, as if naming your roof Jericho or Balaclava could undo some of the cold coming out of the floor from inside the rain. I want to find the sore places where its weaknesses are, under the plastic information point with its history written in imperial feet. Find what's underneath the 6-inch stud collars, steel bones, and the mathematics needed to hold train tracks, signal lights, fully automated levers overhead like it's something utterly ordinary. I don't know what kind of touch is needed for this kind of pain. If I could reach inside and find names for all the broken ferns and small sea creatures, all the surfaces weighted into stone, I might start to understand how to knit together the broken chimney pots, power lines, half-built estates, and ring road into something I could hold for a moment and understand. There is something I keep returning to and keep missing. I put my hands on the stone and listen to my own breathing, dribbling cold gravel over colder ground. So in that poem, I was really using the image of a viaduct, this large stone structure, as an extended metaphor for the speaker's father and the difficulty of trying to communicate with that father and trying to find alternative ways to connect through the power of touch and trying to read something that works more through affect rather than through language. And then the next poem I'm going to read is still from the same collection. And this was published in Best New British and Irish Poets 2018, which is a great series that introduces new poets in UK and Ireland, by the way. If you're ever wondering about contemporary UK poetry, it's a good one to check out. Hefted. One by one, the black-faced ewes file through the gate, up and out of the field, over the burned heather to lamb where their mothers lambed them. I try to pull a map around the stories. I know here is where my father was happiest. If I sit on this rock and let the same cold enter my body, can I say I'm part of it? Plates of ice across the mud crack under weight, catch light, like the light is something good enough to frame and hang in a hall where guests might first enter. His maps were always like that, half an advertisement of his character, half a mirror to hold the face that looked square in its white mount. On and on, 100 or so ewes file through, hefted to the particular slope that bore them. Muscle memory, DNA, where do their bodies hold the bone hunger that leads them back? Precise as a compass point, finding its way through layers of tracing paper and folded map to hold its beam arm straight. Making the distance between point A and point B measurable. And then as time is getting on, I'm going to read from some poems that are going to be in a second collection, which was supposed to be coming out this year, but is increasingly looking like it won't be out until next year, as so many things are at the moment, unfortunately. And I wrote these poems while I was poet in residence at the Pitt Rivers Museum at the University of Oxford. And basically they brought me on board alongside conventional scholars, really, people who are particularly interested in post-conflict resolution and post-conflict reconstruction, to look at the colonial archives. But they asked me to come in and try and use poetry writing methods to make a connection with those archives. And these poems really consider the kind of administrative violence and narrative violence that is in those archives, particularly in terms of the history they try and construct, and how I relate to that and participate in that in a way as a white British woman writer writing right now. So it kind of tries to interrogate the legacy of what's in those archives, as well as just the materiality of them. And then they did a brilliant thing. They put all of our artistic exploits together in the same academic publication as the essays and papers and more conventional things, which is really cool. And I'm going to read a poem called In the Archive. When the door closes, we let the quiet of the archive settle around us. Chilled air from bales of frozen film comes to a stop. The room begins to fill with the hum of the corner unit, rinsing air clean of the contaminant on our clothes, the proteins in our breath. The curator lays the album on a foam cradle. We stand shy of each other, like friends at a christening, not knowing where to stand or what to do with our arms, not wanting to let our voices or breath drop to break the silence. The curator begins with the facts. Mr. Phillips reported how the Juju city reeked of human blood. Sir Harry mustered a force of 1,200 Marines. Mr. Bacon had reason to believe enough ivory would be found to pay all expenses removing the king from his stool. I have come to understand there are various kinds of violence. The boot in the mouth, a ring of bruises around an upper arm, the way that inside this archive each fact slips so prettily beside the next, like a horse's bit lies bright across its tongue. History is the things that have happened, facts of a body and its breath that come to us, a thread through the records and lists, the photographs and their captions curling in neat, even script. In the silence of the archive, all I can hear is the sound of the corner unit, rinsing air clean of what my body brings in, and the white space, page after page of it, absences that still bear the administrator's mark. Okay, well, thank you for listening to my poetry and some of my ideas about the power of poetry to connect us in these strange times, and how it really operates as a tool for connectivity, even in the most normal of times, how powerful it can be. What I would like to do now is, if any of you have brought some poems with you that you'd like to share, if you want to indicate in some way, perhaps by waving, perhaps by typing your comment into the chat box that you'd like to speak, I would certainly love to hear any poems that you might have. I think we have Neil. Neil has got something there. Oh, lovely. Yes, please, Neil.
That's right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I switched my camera off, by the way, because I'm doing a pasta bake at the same time as this. So sorry about that. Yeah.
I love it. Pasta bake and poetry. Who
knew
it was so well?
I'm here to lower the tone, as I did for 4 years at Homerton. 2000 to 2004. Yes, I'll cut to the poem. It's Eden Rock by Charles Causley, my favourite poem in the whole world. And apologies, I've got a cold. I'm slightly breathless. Bear with me. I've been asked to read this poem by The Hive, which is a fabulous library in Worcester, where I am now. I live in Worcester. I met my wife Rachel at Homerton. We've been married 12 years, and we now live in Worcester. And Worcestershire Libraries have asked people to read their favourite poem and record themselves, and the videos will be shared on YouTube and elsewhere. So this is a bit of a practice for me, because I'm going to record myself reading this tomorrow. So would you like me to read the poem, or just waffle on about it? What would you like me to do?
I would like the poem to be read and waffled about. That would
Okay,
be
I've already done enough waffling, so I'll read the poem. Eden Rock. Okay. They're waiting for me somewhere beyond Eden Rock. My father, 25, in the same suit of genuine Irish tweed. His terrier, Jack, still 2 years old and trembling at his feet. My mother, 23, in a sprigged dress, drawn at the waist, ribbon in her straw hat, has spread the stiff white cloth over the grass. Her hair, the colour of wheat, takes on the light. She pours tea from a thermos, the milk straight from an old HP sauce bottle. A screw of paper for a cork, slowly sets out the same 3 plates, the tin cups painted blue. The sky whitens as if lit by 3 suns. My mother shades her eyes and looks my way over the drifted stream. My father spins a stone along the water. Leisurely they beckon to me from the other bank. I hear them call, see where the stream path is. Crossing is not as hard as you might think. I had not thought that it would be like this. Thank you for bearing with me, everyone. I adore that poem. I keep thinking about it. A Worcestershire-born poet called Esther Morgan, who's been published by Blood Axe, I believe, I might be wrong on that, has written a great essay about Eden Rock, and that gap between the last line and the preceding stanza. And I just thought it was a bit of a forced connection with the theme of connection, because Charles Causley's trying to connect with his dead parents, and slightly morbid, but I hope you run with me on that one.
No, I think you're right. It's definitely a poem about connection. And what you raised there is a really interesting point about how form can do so much thematic work in a poem. And you're talking about the separation between stanzas in the poem that's about separation and crossing over. Form is such a useful technique as a poet to get those moments of connection and disconnection into a text as you're writing it. So that's your favourite poem?
It's my favourite poem, and I mean, Charles Causley is amazing. Cornish poet, for those who might not be familiar. He's not, I would say, a household name, but which poets are household names? Ted Hughes, that's Seamus Heaney. Oh, that's a great poem, by the way. I wasn't familiar with that Heaney poem. I'm not a huge fan of Heaney, but I love the poem that you read, Maria. That was amazing. But yeah, the Causley poem, the content, the way he writes about his mum and dad, but also that gap in the last, between the last line and the stanza before it, is meant to mimic the leap across the stream, and the way that poetry can convey meaning in the absence of words, which sounds deeply pretentious when I say it out loud, but I don't care. I studied English for 4 years at Homerton. The college indulged me for 4 years, so they can indulge me now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I don't think it's pretentious. It's my bread and butter. Exactly. And I just want to draw attention to a point here, is that Charles Causley's poem is so specifically about his parents, right? There's that image of, you know, the terrier Jack, who's still aged 2, the mother's sprigged dress, that HP sauce bottle with the twist of paper as the lid. And it's so specific, but both Neil and I, and hopefully some of the others who are here as well, you can have such an emotional relationship to that level of specificity in the poem. And it's a really, really interesting thing about poetry, is the more specific it gets, the more it becomes universal in terms of its ability for people to connect with it. It's a really interesting thing. And the opposite is true as well. The more universal and generalizing a poem is, the less we connect to it. It's a very interesting thing about poetry.
Very well put. Totally agree with that. And I'm also mindful of hogging the floor because Anne has a poem. May I?
Oh, brilliant. Yes, please.
Hi. My poem's quite long actually, but it really resonates with what you're saying and where you've been. I have always had an idea of going to Japan, or I always had when I was studying A-level English at school, and we studied No More Hiroshimas, and basically my A-level history, I remember sitting there reading the poem and just being so taken by it and saying, I will visit this place in my lifetime. And actually I managed to visit there about 5 years ago, and it was incredible. But I think from your poem about being at Newcastle and the coach, this is kind of the connections that it really sort of draws together what you're talking about. It's quite long, so I don't know, I'll read it fairly quickly, but I'm sure some people will have known this and studied it. No More Hiroshimas, James Kirkup. At the station exit, my bundle in hand, early the winter's afternoon, wet snow falls thinly around me, out of the cruddy sun. I had forgotten to remember where I was. Looking about, I see it might be anywhere, a station, a town like any other in Japan. Ramshackle, muddy, noisy, drab, a cheerfully shallow impermiscence, peeling concrete, litter, atomic lotion for hair fallout, a flimsy department store, racks and towers of neon, flashy over tiled and tilted waves of little roofs, shacks cascading lemons and persimmons, oranges and dark red apples, shanties awash with rainbows of squid and octopus, shellfish, slabs of tuna, oyster, ice, ablaze with fans of soiled nude picture books, thumbed abstractly by schoolboys with second-hand looks. The river remains unchanged, sad, refusing rehabilitation. In this long, wide, empty official boulevard, the new trees are still small. The office blocks basely functional. The bridge a slick abstraction, but the river remains unchanged, sad, refusing rehabilitation. In the city centre, far from the station's lively squalor, a kind of life goes on in cinemas and hi-fi coffee bars, in the shuffling racket of pinball palaces and palaces. The souvenir shops piled high with junk, kimonoed Kewpie dolls, models of the bombed industry promotional hall, memorial ruin trickled out with glitter frost and artificial pearls. Set in an awful emptiness, the modern tourist hotel is trimmed with jaded Christmas frippery, flatulent balloons. In the hall, a giant dingy ice cake in the shape of a Cinderella coach. The contemporary stairs are treacherous, the corridors deserted, my room an overheated morgue, the bar in darkness. Punctually, the electric chimes ring out across the tidy waste, their doleful public hymn, the tune unrecognisable, evangelistic. Here, atomic peace is geared to meet the tourist trade. Let it remain like that for all the world to see, without nobility or loveliness, and dogged with shame that is beyond all hope of indignation. Anger, too, is dead. And why should memorials of what was far from pleasant have the grace to help us to forget? In the dying afternoon, I wander, dying around the Park of Peace. It is right, this squat, dead place, with its leftover air of abandoned international trade and tourist fare. The stunted trees are wrapped in straw against the cold. The gardeners are old women in blue bloomers, white aprons. Survivors weeding the dead brown lanes around the children's monument. A hideous pile, the atomic bomb explosion centre, freezing cold, includes the Peace Tower, a museum containing atomic melted slates and bricks, photos showing what the atomic desert looked like, and other relics of the catastrophe. The other relics, the ones that made me weep, the bits of burnt clothing, the stopped watches, the torn shirts, the twisted buttons, the stained and tattered vests and drawers, the ripped kimonos and charred boots, the white blouse polka dotted with atomic rain, indelible, the cotton summer pants the blasted boys crawled home in to bleed and slowly die. Remember only these. They are the memorials we need. And that was written in Hiroshima, New Year, 1960. And it was incredible. I read it again before I got there, and I read it while I was there. And it was just, it's had such an impact on me. And I've been to Japan several times now, and I have a true affinity with the country. And that all came from that one poem that I studied when I was 17. And it's incredible just going around and seeing it all. So everything that you've said about poetry in this workshop, that just resonates for me in that poem.
Wow, that's an incredible poem. I've heard it before, but I actually haven't heard it read out loud before, and it was quite different to hear you speaking it, actually. Thank you so much for sharing it with us, Anne.
Thank you.
I think one of the great things about it is it's very noun heavy. It's kind of a list poem in a way. It just accumulates all of the images of the city. And it's quite a brave and generous thing to do when you do that with a poem, I think, that idea of charis. To just supply these objects that make up a little fictional world for people on the page and let them come in and do their own thing with it, engage with it in their own way emotionally. And then as you've experienced, Dan, that's had a profound effect on you.
I'm wandering around and everything and just remembering everything that he said. And actually, while I was there, I was unwell. I got bitten by something, and a lot of the experiences that people had when they were sort of ill after the bomb dropped, I had some of the same things. So it was a really surreal experience, but it was incredible. And what they've done in that city since is fantastic. I remember walking around the Hiroshima Art Museum and saying, oh my goodness, look at all this art that's here. Look at all of this, and it's just the regeneration and everything, but you've still got what happened and the new and the change. And the people are just incredible for what they've done, and that life and moving on and looking to the future.
While trying to still be mindful as well. Well, thank you so much, Anne. I think we might have another
Jane.
person who'd like. Jane, would you like to share your poems?
Yeah. When I thought about the theme of connection, this is the poem that came to mind, and I don't know if it's the same one that Stephen Fry read by Siegfried Sassoon. It's called Idyll. Oh,
I'm not sure either, but I'd love it if you shared it with us.
This chimes very much with Neil's poem. It's a poem about loss. To me, it's a poem about loss and looking for that person who's gone. I find it very beautiful. In the grey summer garden, I shall find you with daybreak and the morning hills behind you. There will be rain-wet roses, stir of wings, and down the wood, a thrush that wakes and sings. Not from the past you'll come, but from that deep where beauty murmurs to the soul asleep. And I shall know the sense of life reborn from dreams into the mystery of morn, where gloom and brightness meet. Standing there till that calm song is done, at last we'll share the league spread, choiring symphonies that are joy in the world, and peace, and dawn's one star.
Wow. That's beautiful. And beautifully read, Jane, as well. Thank you.
I just love it. I think if you've experienced loss, a poem like that speaks to you so clearly. I I do a course which is poetry by heart, and I do actually know it off by heart, but I wasn't going to test it out today.
Well, you read it beautifully.
Siegfried Sassoon knew so much about loss, didn't he?
Yeah, and it's that line. You won't. I might have written this down wrong, Jane. Please correct me. But you come not from the past, but from that deep. And that is,
yes, from that deep where beauty murmurs to the soul asleep.
And that's one of the wonderful things about poetry, is how it captures the way that time works when you've lost someone. It's like it's a nested experience, like a Russian doll. It's not a linear experience.
It's very comforting, actually. I find that a very comforting poem.
I agree. And that image of the star that it closes on, absolutely gorgeous. Thank you. Do we have anyone else? Oh, we've got people praising your reading, Jane. Yes, I agree. I agree with that. Would anybody else like to share anything with us? Or if they don't have anything to share, you're welcome to ask me any questions about things I've spoken about or my plans for the residency.
Mariah, could I share one of Jackie's poems, please?
I would love that. Yes, please. Please, please, please do.
Now, I'm not sure how good the connection is. Can you hear me clearly?
Very clearly.
Okay. This is a poem that Jackie wrote 20 years after she left Homerton. And I wonder how many of the images that she brings to us in this poem bring back memories from your time when you were at Homerton, or whether more they show that how Homerton has evolved. So the poem's name, the poem is called My Room. I had a room in Cambridge, a monkish cell with just a bed, a bookcase and a chair, a faded rug, a cracked linoleum floor, a scratched and chipped bureau where I would write and stare out of the window by the bed, at the burnished copper beach, across the lawn, and martins wheeling wildly in the air, creating complicated cadences, an airy tapestry of sound and movement, curtaining the panes.
That is brilliant.
It is.
I can see the room. They were like that when I was there. I'm not sure when your wife was at Homerton. I was there 76 to 80. But definitely we had rooms like that there, and it's lovely.
She was there from 1960 to 1963, so she was one of a very special set of ladies who I think set the college on the way to becoming a full college of the university rather than a teacher's training school, because this was the first year in which the course lasted 3 years. And so they added a lot of more information regarding the subjects that the teachers were going to teach, as well as how to teach. And I'm glad that the college still has a strong position in education, but it's good also that it's branching out.
What a fantastic poem. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. I think you might have shared that poem with me before, and the use of curtains at the end of the poem is so extraordinary. I absolutely love it. And I've certainly seen the burnished beeches and the martins, but I have not seen any linoleum in my well, I've only been to Homerton once, very, very briefly. It was much more swish and flash, the parts that I saw anyway. But thank you so much for sharing Jackie's writing with us. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. We'll have to include some of her writing in the anthology that we produce with students and staff and the fellowship over the course of the year. I think that would be really nice. Really, really nice. Well, our time.
Rose, with Rosemary, I think Rosemary wants to say a few words. If you unmute yourself, Rosemary, hold on. Just need to unmute yourself. Just click the little blue box in the top right corner. That's it.
No, this is just a poem. Well, I looked after Homerton College. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, I can.
I looked after Homerton College archive about 7 years ago. This is a poem I wrote about Pobble's Bay in the Gower Peninsula. It's the connection with my childhood. Shall I read it?
Yes, please do. That would be lovely.
Okay. I remembered the turning down the private road, golf course to the right, through the end gate onto a track leading down to the sea, grassy undulating downs, sand between, bracken and brambles. This is how we went with bucket and spade every summer down to the bay. Accompanying us now is a collie, loose and free, meeting with 2 collies returning from their walk. Conversation with owner, dogs on leads. Then on towards the sea, now pebbles and shingle, rushes and a stream to cross. Then the beauty of open space, sand and sea. Sea far out, waves breaking gently in a long line, sparkling horizon. Coves in cliff, caves and rock pools. Remains of sand castles, sunken rills around rocks where waves had swirled. Memories of parents, aunts, cousins, gathering in the coves to sit, talk, run, swim. Tim sees the beauty here. Photographs closely seaweed shells, sense of freedom among this unchanging beauty to pass on to others.
That's wonderful, Rosemary. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. It had some wonderful use of sound in that poem. In particular, the alliteration of brackens and brambles, bucket and spade, and then sit, talk, run, swim. Some gorgeous sounds coming through in that poem. Can I ask you, Rosemary, why you decided to write about these memories of the past, make this connection with the past through poetry rather than a short story or any other form?
Well, I like writing poetry. I've written a lot of poems. I just find I can more succinctly explain my feelings, put the most powerful parts into context.
Yeah, it's definitely a way of distilling, I think, with poetry. It's a form that requires brevity, and that lets us distill the things that we want to connect to, the people we want to connect to. It lets us distill the most important things about them and put those on the page. I think maybe that's one of the reasons why some people naturally fall towards poetry as a form. Thank you so much for sharing that poem with us. It's wonderful. I'm conscious of the time. If people want to stay and share their poetry, that's fine by me, or if you want to ask me any questions.
Mariah, shall I wrap up and simply thank you enormously for that that last hour, and you spoke about images and you spoke about connections, and my head is buzzing with images and connections, thanks to the poetry that you've read, and that's shared by almost everybody on this call. So thank you hugely, everybody, for joining in. Norman, I remember when we first started talking about the possibility of this post, you thought that we could use poetry as a way of connecting the Homerton community, connecting the alumni back to the college and to each other. And it seems to me that we've just had the most amazing demonstration of how that is possible. So thank you for connecting all of us on this call together. Thank you for connecting Mariah with Homerton. And thank you for connecting us all with Jackie by reading that wonderful poem. It's truly appreciated. And Mariah, I think this has been a stunning demonstration of what having a poet in residence will do for Homerton, and what you will be able to do for Homerton. At a time when connection is more valued and valuable and necessary than ever before. If we were in a room together, I think now we would all be standing up and applauding wildly. So I'm going to do that anyway. Bravo.
And thank you to you all for participating so marvelously.
Great. Thank you. And I hope we'll find ways of connecting our alumni with our poet in residence on more than just this one occasion and more than just alumni reunion weekend. I feel there's enormous potential here. Correct. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.